Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. Well, welcome to this new episode of the Classical Queer Podcast. We're so thrilled to be joined by Sam Taskinen here today. And Sam is a Finnish, but you're living in Germany now, correct, Sam?
Yes, for quite a while. Well, I've lived the past 5 years in the German-speaking countries, but yeah, I'm a Finnish bass-baritone.
Finnish bass-baritone. So we're so thrilled that you're here. And we usually... We say, give us a little intro about your background, but I always add the caveat, it can be as like academic-based, music-y based, or non-music based as you want. It's a total, it's a sliding scale. It can be about your training, background, history with like singing, being a bass baritone, or you can tell us all the things that is not related to music, whatever you would like to tell us.
Oh, there's a really loud motorcycle outside, by the way, so I'm sorry if you can hear that, but yeah, I was born like in the southeast part of Finland. It's actually in this town called Lappeenranta, which is a little bit closer to St. Petersburg than Helsinki. And so I grew up on the border, and I had a very sort of diverse cultural education, I guess. I did ballet and all kinds of dancing, and I played the piano and the cello, but it took me a while to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. So I studied all kinds of things like interior architecture and geography and music education and Latin American studies and Portuguese philology before I discovered singing. And that's something I started to do while I was at Sibelius Academy studying music education. And classical music has always been very important to me. And then like somehow opera ended up being something that combines a lot of my passions, you know, dancing, being on stage, making music, languages, like, you know, all of that. And yeah, that's kind of how I ended up doing what I do. And then my career kind of kicked off while I was studying, actually, so I never graduated. But I have the bachelor's degree, but I was doing my master's when like things all of a sudden started kind of snowballing almost, and then I ended up working in Germany, first at Oper in the young artist program there for 2 years, singing surprisingly big roles, actually, like for example Colline in La Bohème. And then before this I had already worked professionally as a freelancer in Finland, like at the Finnish National Opera and with orchestras and such, but then Oper was my first thing in Germany. And then I lived for 2 years in St. Gallen, where I worked at the opera there. And while I was there, I came out as trans, and that kind of changed certain things about like how my career looks now. But now I'm fixed in Staatsdekanat, so in the middle of Germany, and I'll be here for the next season. And after that, the intention is to go freelance. It was quite a long intro, but I hope it's okay.
A question for you. I mean, for an opera singer, I mean, when you look at the really good opera singers, you know, there is this kind of, obviously you're putting on a show and you've got this front that you're putting on, and you being involved with dance and also languages. Do you really think, how much has that helped you towards, you know, being able to, first of all, accommodate the different languages, but also the movement type of thing that occurs within the opera?
It's helped a lot. Like, I also got really good acting training. So in some ways, I feel like I was very well equipped to stagecraft in a lot of ways. And I mean, obviously with languages as well. So it's been an immense help, actually. And I've gotten, like in the beginning, I got a lot of my first jobs because of me being fluent in Russian. And they needed someone who's good at sort of new music and in Russian. So I ended up doing a lot of Shostakovich because of, you know, the trickiness of all of it. And yeah, then it has like really served me well because I can do a lot of different types of movement and change my body language quite a bit, depending on characters. However, sometimes, no matter what I do, I tend to look like someone who used to do ballet a lot. So sometimes, like for me to get into like a rough body language, that can be a little difficult away from, but it's like not impossible, but it just takes a little more time.
This is the thing. I mean, ballet training is it's built into you like so intensely into your body that it is hard to remove that ballet sensibility, that ballet training. You're always like thinking like a ballet dancer. Not obviously not that I am one, but like I know many ballet dancers, and they always say,
No, but like I think like the funniest thing I ever had was like my first job. No, my second professional opera job was like I played this rough character in Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of Zensk district, and I was like a fisherman wearing these huge rubber boots, and I hear the director yelling, "Sam, how can you point your toes in those things? How is it physically possible?" I was like, I don't know.
It's kind of interesting because I think even when you're not doing any artistic things, you kind of move in the way which, you know, I'm sitting here thinking I've got to stop slouching and I've got to sort of look a bit more like, you know, and it's kind of fascinating because when you understand that, you see it is, as Jacob says, built into your every movement. And how do you remove that? I can't see how you can. It's kind of fascinating, really.
Well, you can, but that's why we have the long rehearsal process. And you just have to figure out how that person moves and really pay close attention to that, like at all times while you're rehearsing.
And so you were talking about your career in the past a few years, and obviously everybody's career in like pandemic world has been wild to begin with. How are you finding like both coming out of COVID and also transitioning and new roles and new understanding of roles, and how is that working for your career?
I have gotten extremely lucky, actually, in that I worked all through COVID. And I got paid all through COVID, and we were able to perform for small audiences. And I got also extremely lucky in that when I realized I needed to transition, that it was time for me to do it, and I needed to do it for myself immediately. I had a very supporting boss. So that, like, my boss happened to have trans friends, so he was quite well educated in all of that. So that part was really smooth. I think the biggest difference, honestly, is that before I transitioned, you know, and I was living a more outwardly male passing life, even though I was still like very femme, and you know, embraced that side of me. I like people write about my singing and acting, and after that, people have written a lot more about how I look and about my transness, and not so much of the actual substance of of the work that I do, which is a little like, it has gotten me more attention for sure. However, I already had like a good career going on, but it's taken a different direction in that sense. Coming out also definitely helped open up my voice more because I'm more relaxed myself. So it has extended sort of my upper register a little, in that I have been able to take on some repertoire that I'm able to do before. So it's been a strange time for sure. And I was also supposed to have more of a freelance time already now, but because of COVID, things didn't look so great. Like everything I had got cancelled, and I got really lucky that this solo space opened up in this theater, and I was fortunate enough to get selected to do this job. So it was all in all, I got to this job before I auditioning. So then I had to call this place as well, and they're like, "So this person who auditioned is gonna look slightly different when when the season starts," and they were really nice about it as well.
It's really interesting. You say I think you said the comment about maybe coming out relaxed your voice. Maybe you don't know if you use the word relaxed, but it's interesting. Now we've talked to, I don't know, 3 or 4 trans vocalists who have talked about like just the act of coming out, transitioning, understanding themselves in their truest form, even if they're not trying to change their voice type. And we can talk about you not changing your voice type or roles, but just relaxing into their body has changed their understanding of their voice in such a weird way. And I think for people who are not singers, or people who don't work with vocalists a whole lot, it's easy to forget that the voice is like your body. It is like very much like connected to your understanding of yourself, your mind, your like physical body, but also just like how you like interpret your own like physicality and self. And it has such an effect on how your voice comes through. And it's so like wonderful to hear that, like just relaxing into your understanding of yourself changes your voice. But it's funny that we've heard that so many times, and it's really a wonderful thing to hear. It's so nice to hear that.
Yeah.
I think also one thing that I was kind of interested in that you mentioned, Sam, was that when I transitioned, after I transitioned, I had to go around kind of telling everybody that the least interesting thing about me was being trans, that I had a lot of other things I did in life, my career and everything else. And it kind of sounds that's kind of a similar thing. Everyone's focus is on the one thing, where really what is important is your career, if you see what I mean. And that is always kind of this balance problem. I think it's good for publicity, but it doesn't actually always help. It can be quite negative in some ways.
It's true. Though at the same time, I do know that because, well, as you know, it's not us who have done the work. It's been the generations before us who have made it possible for us to, transition this way and not be, completely shunned by the society. And I do try to think of that as an opportunity to talk about that and to make people realize that we are here in these, like we are only seen because the generations before us have done all of this work, and now we are in these conservative, male-dominant places where we cannot be ignored. We are there, are on the on the stage, or some people are politicians, like all of that. We are there, and you cannot just like kind of easily brush us away. So bringing awareness to that side, I find is to be honest, way more important than my own career in the end. Like, yeah, it's not growing my ego always, but like, ego is not that important in the big picture.
I must say thank you for including, when you said us, you included me in your generation, which I think is kind of wrong. I think I'm old enough to be a grandma, but there you go. But it was nice. So yeah, it is kind of interesting. I mean, as an older trans woman, I do think that today in some ways it's a little bit easier to transition and do it. But I think there are a lot of other disadvantages today, yes. I think, when you transition. So it's kind of, again, it's not better or worse. It's just, I think, different, and I think that's the thing that we have to take from this. It's not, I quite often hear it's better or worse, or you had worse. I don't think that's true. I think it's just different. So.
Yeah, of course, I agree. And I just think like we have this moment now where we can also talk about the long, long history of transness, like centuries, thousands of years long, history. And I feel like right now the problem is that some people think that it's like a fashion thing, which is like, it's so far away from being that. Like, I just think that right now, if we don't talk about that side, this will kind of just remain a gimmick. And we will kind of lose a very important window into these things. And some countries, like in certain states, for example, in the US, that window seems to be closing. So it is, I think, a very important time.
I agree. And to be honest, I think this is why I think people like yourself who are on the stage, on television, on and in the forefront of cultural events are so important these days, because it isn't just like an activist like me shouting and doing this and saying, hey, we need to be recognized. People see you on a regular basis, and it's normalized, that kind of interaction with what you've seen with TV programs and people on it. And I think that is the really fantastic thing as a trans person that people like yourself are able to do today. So I think that's a real positive for me, I think.
Yeah, the visibility is such an incredibly important thing, and it's everyone is on an, we're in an unfortunate conservative slide at the moment, obviously, and it's hitting everywhere, and it's hitting everywhere at different paces and things, and it's interesting to be in Canada and watch the States. I mean, Canada is probably much more, if not extremely more liberal than America, but we are very much seeing, even here, like really similar conversations start to pop up. Where the States is here, we're here, but like it's terrifying to watch the same conversations happen, but it is happening everywhere. And this is why it's so vital to have these like conversations and talk about people being on stage, being present, being visible, being vocally and visibly queer in every space. It's so important to see in so many different ways. And obviously my mantra is always the arts and performance speak to the community that they serve. The arts and performance speak for the immediate city and world that they exist within. And so every organization should have a representation of the community that they serve. And there are trans people and queer people in every community. And so then your orchestra in whatever city you're in should have queer and trans people on stage, because that's who is around. But I would love to listen to you sing. I would love to listen to one of your pieces. And so you sent over a couple. Maybe we'll start with maybe the Sibelius is a good one to start with. And so maybe if you can just tell us a bit about this Sibelius, like what it comes from, what piece it is, and then we'll have a listen.
Okay, so this is maybe his biggest hit, Var det en dröm? Was it a dream? It's quite a beautiful, haunting melody. We did this concert together, pianist, and there was also soprano Grete Fredheim in the same concert, and this was in a museum that is specialized in great tombstones and with burial rites. So we did this concert that talked about that was Sibelius and Grieg's songs about death. So it's a bit of a dark song, even though it doesn't necessarily sound like it.
Okay, let's take a listen. Maybe I could just ask you before we talk about the piece specifically. Sibelius, of course, and being Finnish. I mean, it's kind of, he's the kind of, I don't know what you call it, the patriarchal figure of Finnish music, if you like, and all of this. How as a Finnish person, how does that feel to you, singing Sibelius? Is that kind of important?
It feels different now that I live abroad. In Finland, I was like, oh my God, Sibelius again. Like, I loved those songs, but like everyone sings them. And then all of a sudden, you're in a different country where no one really hears those songs. They might know one song. And then all of a sudden, you're like, wait, there's this part of my culture that I could share with these people. And yeah, Sibelius, I think, was a really great composer. Like, I really enjoy his music. So I also think there's a lot more interesting music in Finland than from Sibelius, but Sibelius is also like this kind of composer that I think is very easy for a lot of people to understand, have like first introduction to maybe more Finnish music in the future.
Interesting. Yes.
The nationalism conversation is always such an interesting thing because we always, like, as musicians, ride this line of, I'm like proud of my composers, I'm proud of my country's music, and at least for me, and I don't know how you feel about Sibelius, Canadian composers always sound folky to me. Like they always, even our kind of older
Yeah.
older Canadian composers, they always sound like just kind of like it's a very
For the listeners here, Jacob is making a funny movement with his arms here, which you can't actually see, of course. But
of course, but it's but at the same time, you're right. I've heard Canadian composers in other countries, and I get very like weepy about hearing like Canadian music elsewhere. But when I hear it at home, I'm like, oh my god, I never can't do another Canadian whatever. So it's interesting that you say that about Sibelius, and because I'm always interested in like expanding my own repertoire. Who are the Finnish composers that you like deeply love that are not Sibelius? Who do you really love to perform or even just listen to?
Yeah, so my all-time favorite Finnish composer to perform is Toivo Puula. He lived quite a short life. He died in the Finnish Civil War because he decided that it was a really good idea to go and pick up a fight with soldiers, which is very smart of him. But he composed this extremely beautiful song literature, I would say. Like there's a lot of really, really hauntingly beautiful songs that tend to be a little dark, and there's almost like a mysticism to these songs, and they have like hints of French song literature, and also something just very unique. And they're one of like those kinds of songs where you can take an enormous amount of time without it ever losing the pulse. It's just a very interesting composer to me. I mean, and then of course I love Kaija Saariaho. I have not performed any of her works ever, but I love to listen to her music.
There's always
she
such
has
a
absolutely lovely music. Yeah,
interesting conversation, especially with countries with such long histories and long understandings of their countries, that the most immediate way into, for me, understanding any language or country is often through like song cycles, and often through composers who write like from that place of where they are. And as much as I joke about like Canadian music, it is still like when you are Marie Schaefer, our letter R, Marie Schaefer is a very well-known Canadian composer, at least here. And I don't particularly love our Marie Schaefer's music, but it is evocative of Canada. It is very deeply tied to the land and the people and the history of Canada. And it really sounds like the vast openness of the Canadian North, like hundreds and thousands of kilometers of just tundra and trees and forest. And it's interesting to listen to like Finnish composers, and it sounds Finnish. It sounds like the country that it is born of. It's such an interesting thing to me. But I think maybe, and you have a different perspective as a singer as well as a vocalist, that when you are also making the sound, when you are vocalizing that sound and speaking in the language of where that's from, it has such a different resonance to me. It's always so fascinating.
Yeah, it's also interesting, like, to know about the Finnish song literature is that we have two official languages. So Sibelius mainly wrote songs to Swedish language poems because his first language was Swedish. He did write something in Finnish as well, whereas Toivo Puula mainly wrote in Finnish. And those languages are very, very different. They don't belong to the same language group. They sound completely different. So that does really impact the rhythm and the vowels and all of that. So that's also like a very interesting characteristic in our song literature and tradition.
It is kind of interesting. I mean, I live in northern Sweden, and half the people here speak Finnish, and the other half speak Swedish with meänkieli and a few other languages. And it is so different when you see all the road signs in Finnish, and then they're in Swedish, and they're in Samiska as well, and it is kind of it is a fascinating. I find Finnish quite fascinating language because of the way you construct the sentences and construct the different ways of doing things and this kind of stuff. It is kind of fascinating. But as you say, I think few people realise that one of the major languages of Finland is Swedish, and that it used to be the language. So it's kind of interesting, really.
Yeah, it's true. My part of Finland was less of that because it belonged, like it was a part of Russia for way longer. So where I'm from, we have a lot more Russian influence in our culture, and it's it's culturally just very different as well.
And I think that's kind of interesting because the whole of, I mean, we get onto geography here, but it is kind of interesting that, because of the history of the Scandinavian and Finnish cultures and countries, you've got this kind of, the boundaries are kind of blurred. When you're here, you can't really tell whether you're in Sweden or Finland half the time. And of course, with the Sami people who roam over the border and this kind of thing. And it is very much all intertwined. It's not 3 separate or 4 separate countries. It is all very, very mixed. And as you say, as you get nearer where you come from, you've of course got the big Russian influence, which is of course a different, and it's kind of not like the older countries, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's kind of not like we've had this sort of fixed perspective. So it's kind of a mishmash, which is kind of nice, really, for me anyway.
Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting. And I think Finland is a very strange country culturally, in that it was always kind of the poor piece of land that several tribes lived in without it necessarily having a very unified identity. And then, like, kind of with nationalism, this entire idea of being Finnish was really formed more clearly. And unfortunately, it lost a little bit of its original diversity. But yeah, my part of Finland is like so different than like the west coast of Finland. And or the north, it's a very interesting, like it was a very interesting corner to grow up in that sense, that it's so like the Eastern Orthodox Church has a very big influence in like our culture there, for sure.
And without knowing how old you are, I'm assuming you've watched your part of Finland also change quite a bit in the last few decades, right?
Well, yeah, I'm 34, so I was born next to Soviet Union, which then collapsed, and then we had a huge economic crisis due to that when I was a kid. So I do remember that it was kind of a gray period in Finland. We had 2 TV channels, it was, but of course, like they had this huge technology bubble that burst at the same time. But then we had the time when Nokia happened, and we also joined EU, and we joined the Euro, and internet happened, and yeah, it's changed a lot. But it's also like when my grandparents were born, it was a country of extreme poverty still. Like all my grandparents grew up in extreme poverty, and they did not have enough food, any of them. And they were just struggling to, like, my granddad started working like heavy physical labor when he was 9. And so it was, and from then to my parents' generation in the 60s, when Finland had just gotten industrialized and urbanized in a big way, they grew up in this very different world from their parents. And then my generation grew up from, like, again, in a very different reality. And now the young, like, teenagers and young adults are very international and very open-minded, whereas, like, my generation still grew up very much in this almost monoculture bubble. So it's it has changed a lot.
I mean, I first went to Finland probably in about the late 80s.
Yeah.
And I mean, when I recently went back to Helsinki, which I know is not your part of the world, but
yeah,
but it has changed a lot. I mean, it is, even since, in the last 40 years, it is considerably different in terms of, just as you say. I think it's, you go to Helsinki today, it's very outward looking. And everybody is international. It's a very sort of different country, I think. So, and that's kind of interesting, because I think a lot of, I think that's true partly of Sweden as well. And I think it's probably partly true of Norway and other countries that it's kind of become more that way. Yeah. And maybe just go back to music, because this is kind of interesting. Do you think the music in Finland has become more international? I'm not quite sure what I mean by that, but do you think it's become, I mean, you always get the feeling that Finnish music was kind of quite introspective, and kind of, when you look at Sibelius, it's always kind of, inward looking towards Finland, and it's kind of, maybe I'm being unfair to Finnish composers of the past, but do you think now it's more international, more outward looking than it used to be?
It's hard to tell, because the artists, like back in Sibelius's time, they all lived in France, Italy, Germany for decades, all of them. And they would just, like, just travel all over Europe to conduct their own pieces. And same goes with a lot of, like, painters. And so they were actually, I think what happened during that time was that, because in general, it was the time where sort of like the national romantic period was happening. It was that they would take everything they learned in Paris and all of that, but then try to find their own soul and to find sort of their voice, also to be like also to kind of stand out internationally. They had to go for the Finnish, more exotic patterns in music. So I think that's kind of actually more what happened. Because, like, Finland was this strange corner that people did not know anything about. So it was exotic in Central Europe.
Do you find that when you sing, that I mean, we've already talked about your sort of how coming out has helped you with your singing. Do you carry sort of, maybe this is not the right word, a kind of Finnishness with you? Do you kind of or are you much more international now? I mean, you spent many years in Germany now, so I guess that's kind of diluted it. But is there like a core of you which has that Finnish viewpoint, if you see what I mean?
That's a very good question. I never felt very much at home in the Finnish culture, honestly. So in some ways, I'm very international. And also, the Finland that I lived in is not there anymore. So like now when I go back to Finland, I feel like I see parts of what was there, but then a lot of things that weren't there. In some ways, I feel like whenever someone is an expat, they kind of become almost like a relic of the time when they left their own country in some ways. Like they kind of cling on to that part of the culture. I see this with my great aunt who has lived in Sari since the 60s. And the way she speaks and acts is exactly like what you see in old Finnish films of that, like still like sort of like that black and white film era, which in Finland lasted until the 60s. So it was just a very, like I have noticed that that same thing has happened to me. So, and I do think no matter where we come from, we always carry our background with us, not just the country, but like how our family was, what we grew up doing, like all of that. And I think ignoring that would not be wise.
It's very interesting. I mean, I am, of the three of us, the only person who's not an expat somewhere, and so it's funny to hear the two of you talk about that experience of like drawing yourself through time and place to a different country. Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
That's what Sam says is kind of interesting because it echoes with me. Is you know I even though I'm British originally, I lived a long time in America and now in Sweden. I don't. The British part of me that I hold is quite old.
Yeah.
And when I go back there, I don't recognize the country. I mean, it doesn't recognize me either. And that's kind of interesting. You still hold on this bit of, you know, thing you carry around, but it is kind of very much out of date. And it's fascinating, really.
Yeah. It's also like then when you do live elsewhere, you kind of change, your body language changes. And what has happened to me the past 2 summers now is that sometimes like when I go shopping or do something, like I've forgotten how the interaction happens. Like I realize that I'm doing something a little off when it comes to the Finnish context of things. And what happens is that people ask like, where did you learn to speak Finnish that well? And I was like, because like my Finnish also, like it's not the language like that I use every day all the time. I kind of live most of my life in English because my partner is American and we speak English at home all the time. We watch shows in English, like, and my German has weirdly been built on my English because it's so much closer. Whereas like translating between German and Finnish for me is really difficult. And of course, Finnish is my better language, but it has it has gone downhill for sure. And like I've forgotten certain phrases, and sometimes I get tangled with the grammar. And it's just I'm making these like similar kind of errors that foreigners make. So
it's fascinating to hear you say that because, you know, as I find, even though I speak a lot of English, my partner's English and I watch English things, because I speak Swedish quite a bit as well, I've started losing my English. And I can't remember certain things that I've learned in Swedish. I can't remember the English word for it. And it kind of screws your brain up. It's kind of very weird sort of thing. So I completely understand that. And I'm useless at languages. So it's kind of even worse, I think. But it's fascinating to hear that you're playing 3 different languages. It's kind of fun sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, we should listen to your other pieces. So you also sent us a piece from Rizolka. Maybe you tell us a bit about this one as well.
Yeah, so this is Vodnik's aria, or Water Sprite's aria, where he is warning Rusalka that she's about to give up this life that would be eternal, and that maybe becoming a human is not going to be a good thing. And it's a very sort of gentle, ethereal kind of warning song, which for my voice type is not that common, actually. So I love seeing that because of that.
Wonderful. Well, here it is. So it's when we were chatting about setting up a time to talk with you, Sam, I was on your Instagram and I was watching you have a pinned thing about singing and being on stage and different roles, and there's a bit, and maybe it's changed, or maybe you have the same feeling or whatever, but you were talking about taking low voice roles and how you spent so long doing those acting jobs as a low voice person presenting as a quote unquote male person at the time, and it doesn't affect your want to take those roles, and you have such a beautiful deep voice and it's so resonant and round and rich, and obviously this role is still that. Do you still feel the same way about taking those like old male roles?
Yeah, it's kind of more fun now that I don't have to try to act that in my personal life.
Right.
Because I have gained, like, it was never natural for me to try to fit in the society as a so-called man, I never fit that mold. But when you don't fit a mold and you still have to somehow fit in, you get really good at masking, which is essentially acting. So I have a really good skill set in that. Of course, like now, because I am quite curvy, I need help from the costume department a lot. Like, and essentially it does look very similar to how like mezzos play trouser roles. Like, it's not gonna look like a man acting a man, which is, it's never gonna be with me anyway, so it's fine. It's just sometimes you need to maybe like widen the horizon with that a little. There have been roles that are written as male roles that the directors have wanted to direct as women for me, because they have found that that would be an interesting contrast to the piece in itself, and that's also fun to do. But I do think like gender in a lot of ways is just a social sort of construct, I guess. So why not play around with it?
And you do get to free it up. I mean, the gender is a social contract, absolutely. And then especially in the conversation of opera, which is so like heightened fantasy world on the base level, and then to be able to play with gender in such a like freer way, to me makes perfect sense. I mean, you're preaching to the choir, obviously, but like to me makes so much sense to be able to play with gender in that way, that you can access so much more character in a way that so many people who maybe don't have that freer understanding of gender and playing with roles can access. To me, it makes much more sense to like deepen that understanding of those roles. But
and it's like also like in my voice type, a lot of the roles are not even human. They're gods or magical creatures, like the water sprite in that. So they don't necessarily have a gender.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I've gotten to sing parts of Wotan in Valkyrie, and I mean, the pronoun is he, but he is some kind of a magical creature. So there's like no set sort of society-based idea of what Wotan should be like, if you think about it. So
do you think that having transitioned actually gives you a better idea of playing a male role. And the reason I say that is because I don't know, for me, I understood more about what a man was when I actually transitioned to be a woman than I did beforehand. And I kind of wonder if you feel the same, and whether that is kind of makes it easier in a way for you to play the male role.
Yes, it does, for sure. I fully, like, especially like psychologically, for sure. There are certain physical things that I cannot do just because I just don't have the upper body strength anymore than what a cis man would have. So because of hormones, you just lose that. And so there are certain things where like we are like acting like, there was this one piece that was so funny to me, like my character was a man, and then it was like we had this like group of men on stage, and at some point like we all lifted up chairs, but they had to bring me a much lighter chair because I couldn't lift up the chairs that the rest of them could. So like there are things like that, and of course like it does affect your physicality a little bit when you don't have the same strength levels in all parts of your body. But like I think those are very trivial things.
And I think what you gain from, because again, thinking about the thread from your Instagram, like what you gain from freeing up, maybe tension points in your voice, or freeing up range things in your voice, are like null and void then from what you might have like in, like you say, different strengths and parts in your body. And it opens up so many different parts of your voice that I think are just much more maybe interesting. Like, have you noticed a change in, because you sing in the same register maybe, but have you noticed a change in your like timbre and your resonance and your like sound creation, singing similar pitched notes, sure, but like timbrally?
I mean, those two examples are a year apart. The first example was after 9 months in hormones, and the second one was before all of that. And the difference I hear in that is technique. Like I've had some big sort of aha moments with my singing between those two things. I have not really noticed anything that would have to do with that. What I did notice in the very beginning when I came out, before like any hormonal changes started to happen, of course, because I had to wait for a while to get to that, was like immediately after I came out, my voice kind of doubled in size. And I had a hard time controlling it for a while, because it was like, oh, there's a lot more voice that I need to support. But like, no, I don't. People always ask a lot about the hormonal changes. I mean, if I'm like completely transparent, what it does to me is what a lot of cis women also experience, is that at a certain time of the month, for a day or two, your body just like retains more water. And then singing is a bit more of a labor. It doesn't like really affect it that much, but it's a little bit more difficult. But I mean, singing is different every day anyway. I just noticed that there's more of a pattern having to do that, but it's like not that it actually affects my ability to sing. It's just, you just have to be a little bit more precise in how you do those things. And in the end, I usually end up like the end result ends up being the best on those days, even though it's the most difficult one, because I have to be so precise to then sing well. So Whereas like sometimes when you have a really easy singing day, you end up singing the words because you just get it a little bit too relaxed and don't pay enough attention to things.
Too easy. Yeah.
Yeah. Like the times that I've had like something weird, like a voice crack happen on stage, have always been those days when everything has felt really easy.
Yeah, I guess you make mistakes when everything gets easy. It's kind of true in
Yeah,
life
or
as a
like,
whole, isn't it?
yeah, and you forget words. Like you just get too excited about like how amazing you are. It's a little bit of a dangerous place to be in.
Yeah, I must admit, there's a when I've seen your videos on stage, and I think this is true of a lot of people I see on stage. It's kind of fascinating because for me, if I was on stage, I mean, I haven't done stage things for years, and I'm certainly not a singer or anything. I'd just be like, oh, look how fabulous! I'd lose it completely. I think I'd be completely sort of overwhelmed by just the enthusiasm for it. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that how do you actually control that? Because obviously you've got have enthusiasm, you're excited, you've got all this stuff, but then you've got to control this voice, which is important. So how do you do that?
I mean,
$1 million question, probably. Sorry.
I have performed since I was 3 years old in different ways as a dancer, but also like I performed as a singer as a kid. I had a really high, kind of loud soprano voice. I don't know, like I used to get really bad anxiety about auditions. For me, what I kind of have started doing, which has helped me a lot, was that before I go on stage, I just think that I'm just going to do whatever I can today. I'm not going to aim at my absolute best level. I'm just going to aim at my normal level, because like the way I practice is going to be the way I'm going to sing. So I'm just going to, like, I'm one of those people who just really relies on that. And I also, if I feel myself getting nervous in the middle of something, I always tell myself that, okay, you can be here, sit on my shoulder, but you're not allowed to speak to me until this thing is over. So I'm one of those people who will shake after a performance.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating conversation. I love talking to musicians about nerves and anxiety and things. Just before I walk out on stage, I try and yawn. I try and tell myself I'm so sleepy, I'm so calm, I could go to bed, because that evens me out. It like brings me to a normal. Because I think if I allow myself to get nervous and shaky, then I'm done for. I'm screwed. But I like this technique of like putting it on the shoulder, telling me I can be nervous and shaky afterwards. It's probably better than yawning and being tired. But if I like even it out that way, I find I then am just at my normal level.
Yeah, I also get really tired before a show. Like I'm always like, how am I going to get through this? Yeah. But I think it's also like your body's very natural mechanism of saving energy for something that you need a lot of energy for.
I'll trust our bodies. I'll trust that they are telling us to just even out and go. And I think that's something that people maybe forget or don't realize, or if you're not a performer, like how physical it is and how exhausting it is to do like maybe like a 2 or 3 hour show. It's just physically and mentally so tiring. And especially I work a lot in new music I'm mainly a conductor, and when you're doing those pieces that require so much like mental work, like polyrhythms, and you're like changing meter all the time, and you're doing all these extended techniques, and you're conducting all these wild things. It's physically and mentally exhausting. And so just to remind your body to preserve energy before you go and do it is an important thing.
And I think like, wait, what was I going to say? Sorry, I lost the thought. Like, what I try to also always remember is like, I'm a human. My body is a human body, and it's not a machine. So if something happens, I'm just gonna, laugh it off. Like, I once did this concert that was like a really big deal, and I sang this really demanding long piece really well, only to crack the last note twice. Not once, but twice.
Oh no.
I was really proud of myself in that I was just like having a hard time not starting to laugh. And because I was just like, phlegm comes up sometimes, and there's nothing you can do when phlegm comes up in between your vocal folds. It's going to be there, and then you're going to correct no matter, like, it has nothing to do with your ability as a singer. It's just crap happens. So it's, I think a lot of musicians are taught that only perfection is good enough, but perfection is actually really boring. Like, I find it as an audience member so interesting if you notice that someone has something, to then see how they overcome that. It's so thrilling.
I mean, I think we kind of, I think we've talked about a little bit about this before, Jacob. We're talking with people about how, sometimes, once it becomes too impersonal, if you like, once it becomes something which is autonomous or automatic, then it kind of loses all the character and sort of, personal, the personal things that you're putting into it. So I kind of agree. I kind of feel that's right. When you see somebody who's either overcoming something or putting their own spin on it or doing something that's a little bit different, that kind of is the excitement in it, as opposed to the I don't say mundane about classical music, but you know what I mean, that kind of, autonomous sort of thing. So
and what I love about opera is that we don't have a set instrument, like, when your body is your instrument, your body is so different every day. And with that, you're going to sing a little differently every day. You're going to sound a little different every day. Your voice is going to do slightly different things in different registers that you have to work around. And as someone with ADHD, that's a great thing to have, because it never gets boring. Like, I always stay interested in what I'm doing because it keeps on changing all the time.
And I think it's kind of, I mean, I think opera is one of those things, because, as you say, you've got your voice is your instrument, but also because it's very visual as well. I mean, it is an acting job as well. And when you look at an opera, you often see very good singers who don't act very well. And then you see some maybe not so good singers who act brilliantly, and it kind of is more fun and enthusiastic. So it's kind of like it isn't just a singing job, really, is it? I mean, you've kind of got a lot of stuff going on there. You've got the acting and everything else that you need to do.
It's true. I am a really good actor. Like, that's kind of what gets me hired for a lot of things. But I actually enjoy recitals maybe even more, because then you become this storyteller through your voice, and it's a very different kind of a more delicate atmosphere. I love both. Like, both are really dear to me, and I'm very much both. Like, I'm very much a recitalist and an opera singer, and I love that a very diverse thing is possible in our job.
So I could jump and ask one more thing here about this, because it kind of fascinates me with the recital part of this.
Yeah.
How much of yourself is in the recital? I mean, if you understand what I mean, how much of it, you've obviously got to sing a particular piece, but how much of you is in that?
I'm such a music nerd that I use endless hours planning concert programs that have a cohesive theme that might be like, this summer I'm doing this recital where it's about Russian composers and poets who had to leave their countries, or who had to live with constant fear of being too political and just getting killed. Or finding links between composers, or whatever it might be. I feel like through that planning, you put so much of yourself, like way more than you do on stage. Because usually when you're doing a piece on stage, you're still very much creating someone else's vision, like the director's vision. Of course, it's a collaboration, but it's not your artistic vision purely. Whereas then in a recital, it is yours and the pianist's vision. And it's a musical vision, and you have way more control over all of that. It's not conducted, and it's way more intimate art form. And I feel quite naked on stage when I do that. And for recitals, I get more nervous as well, because it's way more revealing of who I am. But I also know that being vulnerable like that is my strength as an artist in general. And people want to hear me in those situations, and I feel seen and heard in a very different way than I do on opera stage. But then again, I would not be able to live doing recitals only because they take so much more out of my soul. And opera is physically demanding, but it's more of a craft, I feel, in the end. Of course, you sometimes have to do something that is so heavy and so close to your own life experience that it gets very, very heavy and taxing. But there's still distance to it, because you're a character. You're not yourself.
Well, I think that's probably a lovely place to wrap up in this wonderful chat with you, Sam. It is so nice to meet you, because it's always nice to meet people with their new set of life and repertoire, and we have such a close sphere always, and this is what Sammi and I always say, we know the people we know, and it's so nice to be able to reach out to somebody who is outside of both Sammi and I's sphere of people, and it's amazing to get to hear you sing and hear about your experience singing and your work and your career, and just thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure. I love these kinds of platforms where you just get to chat and there's no agenda and you just talk.
Thank you, Sam. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer Podcast, and Jacob and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.